So you want to review poetry. That's not going to be easy. Those of us who write poetry don't like to be told that our poetry needs to change, as we spend a lot of time trying to get it right. You must remember at the start itself that it is not easy to write poetry. While mastering a language is an art by itself, as Rita Dove says here, poetry distills the language to convey powerful thoughts and emotions. So the first thing to look for is strong emotion, a theme, or a thought. What is it that is being conveyed in that particular poem? We use a checklist to be able to see whether certain details have been covered in the poem that we are trying to review. The first one is the strong theme or message. Second is it able to evoke feelings without a direct use of words? Does the poem follow a standard form, and is that consistently followed? If the poem is a free form of poetry, is there a marked cadence and a flow? Is there any unnecessary use of words? And then, as we would check any language piece, whether the punctuations and spellings have been used appropriately will also have to be checked. We'll now go through each of these checklist items and say what exactly do we need to look out for. People sometimes imagine that poetry is very abstract and difficult to understand, but it doesn't have to be obscure, confusing for that matter. Poetry by itself is a lyrical, emotive method of self-expression. It's by not telling the reader what to feel, it evokes the feeling directly. Yeah, so that's what a poem is all about. So what you need to check is, does the poem make you feel something? For example, let's look at how Wordsworth conveys the emotion of joy when after a long winter he sees the break of spring in the form of daffodils. He says in this poem, Daffodils, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle in the Milky Way. And then he goes on to finish it as saying, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. So you can see here that the emotion that Wordsworth feels almost rubs off onto you. So you need to check if the poetry is conveying to you something that is beyond the words that is written in a piece of paper. The next thing is that poetry by itself, every single word is used to carry maximum impact. So what we need to look for is unnecessary words that could dilute the meaning of the poem. If a single word can convey the meaning more than a series of words, then we should replace that word depending on how it is used. Prose, they say, is words in their best order. Poetry, the best words in the best order, according to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So poetry is a rich, condensed form of the English language. All poems may not be so easy to understand straight away. For example, some poems may require input from the author to understand the meaning. Look at this example of this poem called The Donkey by G.K. Chesterton. He says, when fishes flew and forests walked and figs grew upon thorns, some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born. So this talks about a humble donkey. And in the last verse he says, fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears and palms before my feet. Here the humble donkey speaks about an hour when he carried the King of Kings on Palm Sunday. This is not easy to understand for a casual reader and may require some additional notes. So it might be required that we may need to check with the author what exactly the author is trying to convey in their poem that they've shared with us. Now, form of a poem has a specific structure. So the elements that constitute a form are the line length, the meter, the stanza lengths, the rhyme schemes, and the systems of repetition. So let's go through each one of them to be able to understand the standard structure when we review a poem. For example, lines. The first thing that we look at is how many lines are contained in each stanza. So if there are 2 lines, it's called a couplet. Now, the most common is 4, which is a quatrain. And if there are 8 lines, it's called an octet. So these are the different ways in which the stanzas are distinguished from each other depending on the number of lines that are used. A rhyme scheme is also a pattern of using rhyming words, typically at the end of each line of poetry. So typically the terminal sound that is being used, if it is like right and tight, it rhymes together. There could be a system that says AABB, where 2 adjacent lines rhyme, while ABAB is when alternate lines rhyme. Now, rhyme originally was used as a mnemonic previously, so a speaker can remember the rhymes, and then by using the rhymes they are able to remember the words of that particular piece as it falls into the poem's rhythm. Nowadays this type of rhyme is not so common. There are poems that are written without using rhyme as well. Now, meter is the next part of a form, where meter refers to the part of a syllabic stress that is used in a poem. A syllable can be either stressed or unstressed depending on how each syllable is emphasized. Take the word poem, for example. The first syllable po escapes the mouth with emphasis, whereas the second syllable m escapes the mouth rather quickly. In other words, poem is a stressed, unstressed word. So meter refers to certain sounds and the way we speak it as such. Now, meter is again less emphasized in contemporary poetry, largely because nowadays there are different ways in which the English language is being spoken, and the pronunciation that is being used around the world is varied. So the meter doesn't carry that much of weight as it used to in the days of the sonnets that, for example, Shakespeare wrote, where he had a specific meter to every line that he wrote. So the different meters are also shown there. Now based upon the combination of line length, the meter, the rhyme, it gives rise to the various forms that we have. Now the ghazal, for example, is a maximum of 10 lines with 2 lines per stanza, and all lines have the same number of syllables. The couplet always ends with the same word. Now a sonnet has 14 lines, and Shakespeare all in all wrote about 154 sonnets. A limerick is a poem with 5 lines all in one stanza. So typically it carries like a witty thought. An example goes like this: the wind, the naughty wind blows the girl's skirts high, but God is just, he made the dust to block the bad boy's eyes. So this is a form of limerick. So different forms of poetry are used, and there are multiple, and there are 10 of them that are listed over here. Of all of them, the last one is the one where there's typically the free verse, in which there's no line length, there's no meter or rhyme constraints. It's just free form as such. Now, we will need to, while reviewing, check if the poem falls under any standard form of poetry. Typically, it would be incorrect to employ different forms in one poem. For example, varying line lengths, some lines rhyming, others don't rhyme, or some stanzas follow a different rhyme scheme from others. So we will have to check which form the poem falls under and make sure that it follows those particular rules, if that is the intent. Characteristics of free verse poetry include a lack of form, meter, and rhyme scheme. Now, cadence refers to the natural rhythm of a poem as defined by the changes in pitch, the sound, and the emphasis. In formal poetry, language follows form. So the words must be arranged to fit the poem's meter patterns, the rhyme schemes, and other requirements. With free verse, poems the opposite is the true. Form follows language. So the poem's line length, stanza breaks, internal rhymes, cadence, and overall length are defined by the words that the poet uses. So we will need to be able to calibrate against the way the flow and the cadence of the poem is written, to be able to review it. So ideally it would be good to read the poem out loudly in free verse to see how it flows. Now, in free verse, the space also can be used imaginatively, as in this example here, where the verse is structured in the shape of a swan. Nowadays, poets achieve euphony, or use of beautiful sounds, by combining different sound elements like alliteration, repetition, internal rhyme, and even use of onomatopoeia. So look out for these ways in which imagery is communicated in a formless poem. So the reader essentially will have to visualize the poem without having a form to rely on. Look at our checklist. So we will need to see if there's a strong theme or message, whether the poem evokes any feelings without the use of words directly, whether there's a standard form that is consistently used, and if it's a free form, whether there's marked cadence and if there's a flow, whether unnecessary words are being used, and then lastly, whether punctuation and spelling have been used correctly will have to be checked. Now, this is typical small poetry. Usually there could be longer poetry which is written together in the form of a story, and many stories combined together can form an epic, but those, I think, at the moment is not under our purview, hopefully. So I hope you enjoy reviewing the poems for The Missing Link. Thank you.